Hello and welcome to the second episode of Podcastion, the philosophy podcast where students of philosophy talk to each other, organized by members of the Symposion Study Association for Philosophy at Leiden University. My name is Sven and I'm here with
Kian.
Welcome Kian.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Today we will be talking about processes, flux and becoming. Starting out with a brief historical sketch of process thought, we will soon dive into the problem of unifying change and permanence. But before long, we shall stumble upon the inadequacy of language for describing a true process metaphysic, which will lead us to discuss some metaphilosophical considerations. Then on a final note, we shall ponder the importance of the human perspective for metaphysics. I hope you guys enjoy the show. Okay, so process philosophy, process metaphysics. I think that the reason why I think it's interesting for us to talk about this, maybe this is a nice start, is that really it's not something that's talked about all that often.
Well, it seems to be relatively popular, at least like among people who study philosophy, maybe, but it's not very well promoted in the university circuit, at least in Leiden.
Yeah, exactly.
But I know a lot of people who are very much attracted to the idea of process metaphysics.
Yeah, well, let's hope they'll listen to this.
Let's hope so.
This episode.
And let's hope we can convert some substantialists as well.
Oh yeah,
implicit substantialists.
So those Aristotelian fanboys, Aristotle fanboys. Okay. Well, maybe for the people who don't know what process philosophy is, we might would be
give a historical backdrop.
Yeah, get a little bit of a idea of what it's all about. I think we should start at the beginning, the locus classicus.
The locus classicus,
if you will.
I will.
And that is Heraclitus. Mm-hmm. Heraclitus is really at least he's considered the first process philosopher, but he's also quite enigmatic. So there's a lot of interpretation left there. But his famous pantarei, everything is flux, everything changes. Everything flows, yeah.
You can never step in the same river twice because it will have changed.
True.
And be a different river.
But actually, I might want to get back to this quote later, because there's two versions of it. There's the Heraclitus' own one and Plato's reinterpretation of it. But it might be interesting after a while. But anyway, I think to understand process philosophy, we need to understand substance metaphysics.
Probably.
And I guess a lot of us do understand process metaphysics, but to be explicit...
You mean substance metaphysics?
Sorry.
Yeah. Well, it's implicit, right? It's built in.
Yeah, I think it's especially in our thinking. It's really in our general day-to-day life and also in our broader societal.
Yeah, we experience and we interact with a world of stable unities of objects. We don't really see the change. We rather focus on the stability of things. I think that's you have like more and less complex versions of that, but I think that's at least the implicit cognitive bias to see things as unities, to see them as stable throughout time, and to kind of base that as the fundamental character of what a thing is.
Yeah, I think it's about supposing that there is something. It's always like there's something underlying all properties,
right?
And that there is some kind of bare particular to which all things are done too.
So I guess the dominant version of this in the modern scientific worldview would be thinking of something like an atom as the substance, right? That's the thing that lies underneath and gives rise to the object, right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess not the real chemical atom as we know it today, but the philosophical idea.
Philosophical.
Yeah, that you have this unit that will be the bearer of properties, so to say, and that itself doesn't change, but its properties might change.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is, of course, perhaps the problem that both substance metaphysics and process metaphysics answer, but in my opinion, I think process metaphysics does it better. Is the problem of change, of explaining how it is that we live in this world in which there seem to be these clear cut objects with boundaries, but they change all the time. And as soon as you say that, there's this question: okay, well, but what is it that changes? Is the vase that is whole today and that I break tomorrow, are they the same vase or not?
Yeah, or even more concretely, am I the same person that I am tomorrow, or something like this?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, in that sense, I think it's a very fundamental.
I think so
very
too.
fundamental problem in philosophy.
Yeah. But I guess it isn't really the problem for the process metaphysician, right? It's rather the solution. So they then have the problem of explaining unities.
Well, yeah, true. It's kind of a vice versa problem. The substance, Aristotle needs to be able to explain how things change when they're supposed to be these enduring objects. But the process metaphysics needs to explain why it seems that they're, well, maybe there are, but there at least there's regularities in the world. I think that's one thing we can safely say, that even though my table might change and it might break it one day, it's got a quite regular appearance in my life, being in my room every day for the past couple of months now.
And you can even when you think about the two objects which are next to each other, which are quite different, and kind of this, they're materially different, they're formally different, their properties are different, and they're both undergoing the similar changes, right? So let's say, I actually didn't think of a concrete example for this, but like water and a table, right?
Yeah.
And they both, let's say, collect a layer of dust. And in that sense, their mass increases, their form changes, they become different in some relatively unimportant sense. But there's still something we can point to as, okay, this is the table which has changed, and this is the water which has changed. And then there is some kind of differentiating substance that seems intuitively what we would point to as kind of the thing undergoing the change.
Yeah.
Because there is such a difference in property and stuff.
But the question is there really?
Well, yeah, that. I mean, I think that there is, at least. So I think, isn't there a difference between water and a table? I think I can think of a few differences.
Yeah, but is there an underlying thing that changes? Right,
or if that's something that we construct. But I mean, this difference has to be explained somehow, right?
Yeah, no, for sure. Go.
So Heraclitus is rather enigmatic. Maybe we should move forward into what we would now more concretely think of in the process metaphysics tradition.
Yeah.
So we were talking earlier about which thinkers we should discuss.
Yeah, it's true. I think, there's a list, but I don't think we want to...
No, we don't want to just list the Wikipedia page.
Yeah, exactly. But I don't know, do you want to go chronological? Or should we just go past mention them and then talk about the ones that we actually find interesting?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think I would already go straight towards the kind of 19th century German philosophers, right?
Yeah. Quite quickly.
So there's not a lot happening for the process metaphysician in between.
No, true. The Middle Ages have been dominated by Aristotle and his substances. So. Absolutely.
Descartes and Kant as well. I actually argue this in my thesis, that Descartes and Kant inherit the first principle foundationalist logic that begins with Aristotelianism, insofar as they're both looking for the kind of foundational causes or the foundational criteria of subjectivity. So they kind of subjectivize this metaphysical attitude of Aristotle. So I think even as far as Kant, this is not a trend which has been broken.
Yeah, true. Well, I think then the first step is Hegel.
Yeah, I think so.
Right after Kant.
Yeah, of course.
And Hegel, I think he's definitely a process philosopher. There's a lot of movement in his thoughts.
Movement, indeed. Yeah, we're both taking a course on Hegel right now on his dialectical method. And one of the primary concept, or I shouldn't use the word concept, it has a technical sense
Yeah.
for him. But one of the things that he works with a lot is the idea that logic is not a series of, or a form, but is a movement
Yeah,
with three distinct moments that we can maybe point to.
the movement of thought.
Exactly.
He's trying to describe.
Which is a trippy way to approach epistemology and logic, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, for me, well, actually, maybe this is this is where I can get back to the Heraclitus quote, because Hegel, he talks about Heraclitus as well, or at least he inherits something of Heraclitus, but at the same time he also inherits something from Parmenides,
Yes.
who would be
the diametrically opposed substance. He's
exactly.
If for those who don't know, the guy who says that there only exists being, the present being, and time and movement are illusions. And
there's only being and no being, and therefore there is no change.
Right.
And so I think in a sense he is like he's probably the locus classicus of the substance metaphysician, and where, although of course Aristotle has done much more for that area, but Aristotle at least he tried to explain change. He didn't just
deny it outright.
Reject it.
Yeah.
But I think what
Lazy
we see in Hegel is that he's trying to incorporate both, right? And he's like, okay, well, there's definitely movement going on, but we can't just say that there is just there's also things, there's also units.
And I think he's right about that. Yeah.
And this is the quote from Heraclitus, because he, like, you mentioned you
can never step into the same river two times.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the Platonic, when I forget where, but Plato relates this statement from Heraclitus, but Heraclitus's own, or at least what is suspected to be his own formulation of it: upon those who step into the same rivers, different and again different waters flow. And so here, actually, already there is the opposition between being and becoming, if you will, of change and permanence, is held together in the same sentence. Like those who, it's not that we step into different rivers. He says, well, if we step into the same river, like there is the same river, but it'll always be different waters. And so the very movement of the water and the change of the water constitutes what we call the river.
Right.
And I think this is what Hegel tries to approach as well, don't you think? And I do think,
I think that's right. Yeah.
Like his dialectic of saying, well, we take the one, we take the opposite, but you're not there yet, you know? You need to unite them in their difference.
Right.
And not just treat them as two opposing sides but really, make one coin out of it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's right, yeah. I think, but I'm reminded here of one of the things which I'm really attracted to in process metaphysics, but also what I'm attracted to in Buddhism is the idea that we conceptually construct most of our reality. And I don't know why that idea intrigues me so much, but I think it always has, to some extent, that we kind of fabricate the world as human beings. And I think there's quite some truth in there.
Yeah, for sure.
So then something like a river, there is no river. There's just different waters. There's just water. And even water is a stretch, right? There's just, I don't know, just flowing. Just energy flowing.
Pure becoming. Well, I think you're right on that. In that, I think this is actually why I prefer process metaphysics over substance metaphysics. While both try to deal with this opposition between permanence and change, the process philosopher, he takes the change as, well, in a way, a bit more fundamental. Like you say, if you look at this river, like really, there's just the flowing of the river. But as soon as I say the river, this is a concept that I use to identify this change and bring it into this permanent one, right? But that has a more nominal status, because this, like you say, this concept, it really is a unity of this difference, but we think of it, there is something less fundamental about it, and I think this is
Because it exists in thought.
Well, I mean, the flowing. If you want to go all Hegel on it, yeah, everything exists in thought.
Yeah, sure, no,
but that's
I'm
not really what I
not-
mean.
Yeah.
You know, it is saying that there is concrete reality, particular reality, and that reality is always changing. It's always becoming. There's never really the same. But these concrete changes, they can cohere into these patterns that we can unite and place under concepts.
Here comes Whitehead.
Well, yeah, here comes Whitehead. Well, maybe not quite yet. But,
Okay.
well, the thing is, here comes Plato. That's actually the thing, because I think we should go there.
Okay.
Well, quickly go back to Plato.
Just a quick 2,500 years.
Yeah.
Nobody will notice. Yeah.
No problem, because this is precisely what Plato did. Well, although maybe it depends on a bit on how you read them, you could say that for him, his eternal forms are the most fundamental.
Right.
This is true.
That's always been my superficial understanding of it.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is okay, but regardless, there is regardless of which one is, primary in a sequential sense, or I don't whatever, there is this sense in Plato that he has the particular reality which is always changing, and he has the permanent forms. And
See, but I don't think anybody would deny this. I think this is I mean, you can't deny
there is
that.
a level of abstraction there. Whether or not you value this abstraction as the ultimate reality or the particular
exactly the
changing, which one you value more, that's even besides the question. But you can see already.
Is that besides? I think that is fundamentally the question.
Well, I think it is a question as soon as you start doing process philosophy, I think. But when you are still choosing between substance and process, I think substance metaphysics doesn't get confronted with that problem yet.
That substance metaphysics doesn't get confronted with which problem?
With choosing of whether the concrete changing reality or the abstract solid reality. If we talk,
I think it does. I think it chooses the latter. It's positively on the side of the latter. I think that is that's the differentiating criteria between a process and a substance metaphysic.
Yeah,
right?
true. But they prefer the permanent, but they concretize it. They say, well, that's not only more fundamental, it is also more concrete in the sense of reality, I think. Well, maybe we're not really disagreeing here. We're kind of just.
It could be that we're not disagreeing. I do see, though. I think we probably don't disagree. But I think that there is something that, at least based on what you just said, I find contentious, because I think that no philosopher.
Well, I'm just sitting here talking and with some shoof.
So. Shout out the shoof. No, but I mean this idea that that there is change, that there is flux, at least in the world of appearances or the world of matter or whatever the philosopher would like to name it, that this is something that I think every philosopher will have some accountenance for. Whether they call it an illusion, whether they call it the dirtiness of the material world, which doesn't have the proper light of God shining on it, whatever they want to call it, that there's definitely an awareness of change, but it's this kind of psychological fear of change. Yeah. You know what I mean? This idea that, oh, well, if something is finite, then it's not that good. It's not good enough. And we have to look for something a little bit more.
Yeah.
Yeah, the permanent, the eternal, this is the goal. This is very an intellectual fantasy, I think.
Yeah. I think that intellectual fantasy you still see reflected in today's modern thinking, in the scientific worldview.
How so?
Well, if you now we're jumping out
right
again.
History is our plaything.
Yeah. Well, because in science, we are often describing processes of change. We are trying to, in science, we try to describe the behavior of the universe in a sense, but we try to do it from this super. From this standpoint that is eternal, from this God's eye perspective. And I think that is like precisely the maybe the epitome of that idea is the Einstein-Meinongian view of the four-dimensional universe, right? That there's like, sure, there is change that happens in time, but ultimately you can describe that as one object that just is. That it always has been and always will be, because it includes time inside itself, and and we can describe that from outside of it, or at least that's the idea. And I think that is a kind of an extreme extrapolation of this idea of taking eternal being as this ideal.
I think we're stumbling upon an interesting relationship between eternalism in philosophy of time and substantialism in ontology, right? Eternalism in philosophy of time is pretty similar to what Sven just described, where you think of the universe as kind of, or you think of time as something which we experience, but ultimately the universe does not possess in itself. Rather, it possesses only as a dimension of itself. And then substantialism, something we already discussed, we already explained. So I think that there's a really interesting connection between those two ideas, in that eternalism does seem, in some sense, to be the substantialization of time, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. That's just.
Well, I think from here on out we can go back a little bit and go to Bergson maybe, because he was very much opposed to this, right?
Right, exactly.
I mean, he saw that it is precisely, and Whitehead for that matter as well, in that if you take this eternalist perspective, you lose creativity in the pure sense of the word. I mean, yes, within time there's new stuff happening, but there isn't really anything created in the universe, because everything already eternally exists. And so, and I think that is something that process philosophers like Bergson and Whitehead do very well, do much better on explaining
creativity.
Yeah,
I think that's a good point. But I am tempted. So first, maybe it would be helpful, I think, to investigate the fact that Bergson might be the first process philosopher to be throwing around arguments. And that's very exciting. And his arguments generally operate around evolutionary genealogy of our faculty of intellection, conceptualization, language, analysis, all of these being kind of tools which give us advantage over our environment. And I think that this is a really unique or interesting insight. Maybe it's not that unique because I think you already have it kind of in Nietzsche, but I guess they didn't interact, unfortunately. They were alive at the same time. It's really a pity.
But also I think Nietzsche had a very different approach, a very different style.
Definitely different style, but they both think that rationality is an evolutionary phenomenon and therefore misapprehends, quote unquote, misapprehends the way reality, quote unquote, ultimately is. Because those last phrases Nietzsche will have a big problem with. This idea that we stabilize things, Nietzsche uses the word mummify reality, because there's this loss of movement and what the senses show us, this change. And that what gives us the notion that there are substances, what gives us this idea that there has to be something underlying? Well, these guys think it's actually rationality, and rationality is something which is for us as a species, not for us as truth seekers. And I think that's a really influential distinction when we're thinking about something like process. And this is where I, as somebody who's attracted to it, really get my kind of justification for it, because I see these conceptualizations as something which is just evolutionary.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're right in that sense, because concepts, I mean, they're very practical. I mean, they're not like, I don't hate concepts.
No.
Actually, I love them.
We wouldn't be able to do this without them.
Precisely. They're usually immensely practical and beneficial.
Yeah.
And so it's really not difficult to see how they would have
exactly
evolutionary benefit. But yeah, I think this is, I mean, you're probably more well versed in Nietzsche than I am, but I believe he talks about that there's this diametrically opposed ideas of practicality and truth. That as soon as we try to do things that benefit us in a practical sense in our lives, we kind of go beyond what is really there.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah,
we do this with concepts because we box the world around us into these things that we can use.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it is about use. And I think that, although Nietzsche would not want to say that there is a way that things ultimately are, he's very opposed to this kind of Kantian framework where there's an underlying reality and then a world of appearances. Nonetheless, this idea that there's a falsifying character of consciousness, that even if there isn't truth before, that consciousness distorts. And I think that's this also, I think, is in Buddhism. And we didn't really talk about them as process metaphysicians, but I think there is something there.
Well, at least on the denying the reality of concepts, or at least the opposition to fuck that word, man.
Hypostatization.
Exactly. Hypostatization. This opposition to hypostatization in Buddhism is I think is a very reification. Yeah, exactly. Is in this same vein of thought.
Absolutely. I mean, and there is also a focus on impermanence and transience.
Yeah.
So I think that
it's the first noble truth, man.
Exactly.
Oh no, that's not true.
It's the second noble truth. Yeah. But whatever.
Yeah, it's
this already. Now we're dividing them into concepts and reifying them. Oh no.
Yeah, change is fundamental for them too. Yeah, of course.
So then, what intrigues me is this idea that our experience of the world has been constructed, or maybe constructed implies a creator, but has evolved in such a way that we don't really have what we might think of as true epistemic access into things. And then I think this is actually a problem for the process metaphysician, because if we achieve the kind of epistemological skepticism about objects and concepts that the process metaphysician is likely going to begin their argument with, how are they going to defend the phenomenological experience of flux and change as that? I mean, those things are experienced too. You know what I mean? Because I think this is the interesting conflict that we have between the eternalist and the substantialist, right? Or sorry, I'm kind of not speaking as clearly as I could, but the philosophy of time debate and the ontological debate. Because between those debates, or between the ideas within those debates? So the between those debates, you have in the temporal debate that the eternalist wants to deny the validity of the phenomenological experience of change, because they think, yeah, well, okay, we experience a bunch of shit and experience isn't actually as trustworthy as we thought it was. Maybe we should be a lot more critical of it. And then when we're being critical of experience, we might end up doubting this phenomenological change. Well, in a way, they're trying to explain it away. They're not denying that I'm having the experience of change. They're just denying that is something fundamental. Yeah, exactly. Okay. So, same page. But regardless, what we have in both cases, the process metaphysician versus the kind of eternalist, they're both denying something of our phenomenological experience. And it's a rather radical denial. And I don't really see fully the grounds for either one, because I feel either argument could be brought in favor of one or the other if you abstract it far enough. So this evolutionary argument, if you bring it far enough, you say, yeah, there's no concepts, but there's also no time. And what there is ultimately could be some Parmenidean unified being. Does that make sense? Yeah, you're kind of like turning the process view back on itself. Exactly. And it's just tracking back all the way. Well, because I think that these arguments, they are really skeptical arguments, right? They're arguments that show, okay, actually, this conceptualization faculty, not that trustworthy, and here's reasons why we might think that. So you don't have a knockdown argument. You just prod little bubbles of skepticism, and at some point, you bring the reader to the stage where they're like, fuck, yeah, you're right. I can't trust my willingness to stabilize things and make them into unities and make them stable over time. That's faulty. What I should trust is the more fundamental experience of temporal change. And then on the other hand, you have somebody saying, no, you can't, this is evolutionarily constructed, like the being is easier to, get evolutionarily, like it's easier to get a hold on the world if you experience like moments sequentially and like change through time. This is an evolutionary construct or whatever kind of consciousness. It's a particular thing to consciousness. What you really have to think of things is in the most abstract, stable, eternal sense.
Yeah.
And then it doesn't really seem to be a reason for preferring one over the other.
I see. I'm trying to see if I can get some something against that.
I have one idea, which is that, and this is a nice Nietzsche quote, which I'll whip out from the Hollingdale translation of Twilight of the Idols, where he says,
sure.
yeah, of course, which is that we fall into a rude fetishism when we take for granted the metaphysical presuppositions of language. And I think that's damning, first of all. Very well written, very nice. But at the same time points to what I see as very critical about this idea in process metaphysics, which is that our language structures so much of our thought, and language relies upon stable unities, relies upon concepts, relies upon stability to some extent, propositionism, right? And that is something which I can very easily see, okay, well, this is really what we're trying to combat. This is the consciousness, the part of consciousness which not only can it be explained away, but you can point very clearly genealogically to where this became dominant in our thought.
This propositional attitude.
This eternalism
not
comes...
a propositional attitude, that's something specific, but an attitude towards propositional thinking.
Exactly, yeah. Or our tendency to think propositionally.
Well, I think this is, I think propositional thought or predicational thought, I think maybe that is even better. Or probably Nietzsche would be satisfied with propositional.
I don't know, he didn't use that word.
Yeah, well, whatever. But I can see that predication, having subjects and predicates, it's really you get into a lot of problems. But at the same time, I think it's kind of a battle I'm fighting in my own head lately. This on the one hand, I see how cutting up the world into these objects with predicates, with properties, and making propositions out of them, making sentences that you try to be true, that this is definitely inadequate to really talk about how life, at least to me, is presented or appears. But that at the same time, I need them so much to understand, because without having these nice boxes of objects with these specific properties, you get lost very quickly in thoughts. At least I do, in the sense that I mean, this is probably why our course on Hegel, I'm struggling so much, because he's trying to do away with all these nicely defined terms that have a meaning on their own, and I can see how that is true. But at the same time, I think we're at the same time bound to our language, and I think this is especially true for philosophy, because I have the same intuition as well, that language is fundamentally inadequate for describing reality.
Right.
But
because it emerges very practically. I mean, you can think very clearly where this comes from. Okay,
exactly.
It's for communicating about our environments and how we're going to get, practical utility out of there.
But it doesn't, it's very inadequate in that sense. But at the same time, especially as philosophers, it's all we got, man.
It's all we got.
It's all we fucking got.
Until Elon Musk makes some crazy shit. We're stuck.
But like it's our toolbox.
Yeah.
And I think this might be a nice bridge to Whitehead,
oh, interesting. I was thinking
we're gonna have to be able to talk to him when we talk about process metaphysics anyway.
Absolutely.
But for him, he sees this as well. He sees like, yeah, sure, language it's fundamentally ambiguous, and because of the way that it's structured in these nice compartmentalized hierarchies, right? And that's just not how the world works. Also not to Whitehead. And he makes this argument that he sees the inadequacies of language, but he's not giving up. And it's not like, okay, well, we should just go home then because we can't really get there anyway. He's like, no, we should develop new language that will be, maybe it'll inherently fail to really get at the truth, but at least we can get better at it.
Right.
If we throw out the dictionary that Aristotle used and write our own, maybe at least we can get a little bit of a deeper, truer understanding of what's going on. And that's one of the reasons why Whitehead is notoriously difficult to read, because he makes up his own words.
Right.
And he builds up his system of new concepts that, he needs them to describe the kind of structures that he sees in this ever-evolving universe. Because Whitehead, he talks about actual entities, he calls them, and these are the most fundamental units of the universe, and so in a sense that is atomistic, but they are not substantial. They are processes rather, but they are the tiniest kind of processes what there are. Okay, it doesn't matter.
I'm becoming very skeptical.
Yeah, I'm not. I don't really want to get into the details, and it doesn't really matter either. But the thing is that he
invents this new vocabulary because
Yeah.
our conceptual apparatus that language implicitly gives us is insufficient, right?
And he tries to, with this new language, he tries to bring back creativity back into the universe. His primal metaphysical principle. I mean, I was just talking about his ontology exists of these tiny little processes, but his metaphysical principle that is just the most fundamental is creativity to him. He says, like, that is what the universe is all about and what we need to explain. And he has a god in his system, and I must say it's a very abstract god. It's not transcended. It has nothing to do with Christianity, although Christianity has.
They love it.
Oh, they fucking love it. They hijacked Whitehead gods. But I'm already getting distracted. Like, the point is that even his god is subsidiary to creativity. Like, it's
in
not
the sense God is created. God self-creates.
God is just like you and I. He's a process in time, and he's therefore contingent. But I mean, he has a very important role. This is true. He has a very special role, and this is why he calls it God, because there is no better word for him. But God is subservient to creativity itself. He does not create the world out of its own. It's more that
there's logical laws maybe of creativity, or what can be created, the way creation can function.
Yeah, there is a way in which God does partake, to use a Platonic term, in the creation of a lot of things, or rather those things partake in God, because so God for him, all of a sudden we're talking about God. God for him has two sides. Has the one side holds the forms, the Platonic forms. He calls them eternal objects, Whitehead. But these are the patterns of processes that you can recognize, that repeat, and these need a place in his universe. Just like Plato, he needs a kind of Platonic heaven. And I mean, Whitehead is a very big fan of Plato.
Right.
I still don't know exactly how I feel about that, but okay. And on the other hand, God is like the register of the universe. All the past history is recorded in his other nature.
Okay.
And so Whitehead is often there's been a lot of studies comparing Whitehead with Buddhist ideas because of his fundamental change, and his denial of this language, the adequacy of language. But there is one fundamental difference, I think, between the more Buddhist approach and the Whiteheadian approach, is that for Whitehead, the universe is only open-ended on one side. So history for him is permanent. and that allows him to be able to build up an evolution of creation that builds upon everything that came before. I mean, it
Interesting.
It allows him to explain evolution very nicely, I think, because there's, you have a history, you have ancestors, and that will inform you. But in the moment that you have all these causal inferences from the past, but there is some freedom to create something new in the future. But anytime you do that, you petrify that moment, and it will be a cause for the future forevermore. Well, maybe I'm getting a little bit abstract now. But
Well, this is very interesting. I really, I can't be critical or anything because I just don't know enough Whitehead. But what I am intrigued by and would like to pursue a bit further, I can't believe I'm going to say this, but philosophy of language in this mixture. I usually am not a huge fan of philosophy of language, but I think in this context it's very interesting to think about because I think maybe we could delineate a few different camps of the way of process metaphysicians using language. Yeah. So on the most extreme, on one side of the spectrum, you have Whitehead, who creates a new vocabulary, a new set of concepts in order to describe reality, in order to make sense of processes, right?
Yeah.
But then as you move over the spectrum, you have Bergson, who's a little bit less technical and logical. He uses analogies a lot, for example, in order to make his points. He kind of guides you as an author, which is very interesting, and I really enjoy that role that he plays because you feel as if he's holding your hand down the conceptual Mary Lane and taking you to the right destination.
Nice. Yeah, and Whitehead doesn't do that.
Whitehead doesn't do that.
He pushes you into the deep end.
And nor does the guy on the furthest end of the spectrum, Nietzsche. Nietzsche doesn't fucking guide you. You get your hermeneutical boots on because this is not going to be easy. And he goes so far in the extremes of metaphor in order to express that which can't be expressed in language, because each of them is dealing with the fact that, right, our language is not suited for the proper, not suited properly for this task. Whitehead makes new language. Bergson plays with language as a guiding tool, and Nietzsche uses almost exclusively metaphors to talk about this. He speaks very metaphorically and abstractly. And interestingly, both extremes of the spectrum are very difficult to understand what they're saying. But I have to say that the Whiteheadian approach seems quite flawed in a fundamental sense to me, because we're talking about describing the world in terms of processes, and he's creating stable unities which possess an underlying meaning. And even if that is not a meaning that you would expect, and even if that meaning is a little bit more on the philosophic, the process, the more dynamic oriented side, it still is, he's still using in his toolkit that which is attempted to be refuted by process metaphysics, right?
I'm not so sure, but I see what you mean, and this is the thing.
This coming from a guy who never read it.
No. I mean, I've read Whitehead a bit. His Process and Reality, I've gone through it once, and I probably need to go through it at least 3 more times in order to get a really good hold on it. I mean, I share your worry that he does explain. His metaphysics does seem atomistic, almost explicitly so. But there is something very strange going on that I haven't really fully understood yet, so I won't be able to really explain it here. But the processes that are fundamental to him, these processual atoms, if you will, they are really not that much like what we ordinarily think of as a process when we think of, I don't know, a tornado passing by or a waterfall. These paradigmatic processes. They're not really like that. I mean, he would say that those are processes as well, but he has a higher layer in his hierarchy to express those kind of larger scale processes. And the thing that the problem is that there's something very difficult for him to understand on this most fundamental level, because inside of one process there's a lot of things happening, but for some reason, and I really don't understand this yet, these steps that he describes that constitute one fundamental process are non-temporal somehow. And I see you frown, and I understand, I get it, but I just can't really put a verdict on that yet.
Okay.
But one of the things I'll say this then about Whitehead, for all that he's worth, I think he does one thing that is very interesting, and that is including perception, or rather explaining perception, at a fundamental metaphysical level. Something I think that he's quite unique in. Maybe there's probably, since of course there's been more people thinking about it, but he does not believe that that mind and perception is something that is generated at higher levels of reality, of the complex systems that, for example, us humans are. So what I mean is,
I think now I'm remembering something I learned about him earlier, where he has this kind of idea that there's kind of points which are like locuses of perception or something like this.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't really know.
Well, this is the thing. His fundamental processes, actual occasions, what they are not marbles in a universe in the substantial things, but what they do is they are a process of perception, really. And so if I am to describe the identity of one process, if I were to describe the identity of a philosophical atom, a substantial philosophical atom, I could do that with these attributes, and I can describe it completely self-sufficient, right? In without regarding the rest of the universe, I can describe this part of the universe. And for Whitehead, he says you can't really do that with my actual entities, because their very identity lies in the fact that they look outwards and perceive and then interpret the world around them into themselves. And the very process of that perception, that is what they are. And so they don't last. He uses the phrase that a process, it's always in a process of becoming and perishing, but never really is. That the process disappears as soon as it's finished doing what it does. And
which is perceiving?
Which is perceiving. Okay, so and the last, well, not the last point. It's becoming
dangerously implausible to me.
Well, it's I think it's quite beautiful, because what he says, another of his famous quotes, and I think this harkens back to what we talked about earlier, about this opposition between, explaining change and permanence, explaining many and one. And he says the many become one and are increased by one. And what he means by that is that the process looks out into the world, and he takes all that information, and he unifies it into one interpretation. And that is a new, and that is the moment of creation as well, because it's a new perspective on the world. And so, I mean, his stuff is very abstract, right?
Yeah, of course.
But for me, the way I can actually make a little bit more sense of it, if I take it to a much higher level, just to me as a person, what am I? What is my identity, right? Well, I'm definitely not a fucking Cartesian soul, I'll tell you that. Okay, we can debate that, but that's just my person.
I have no desire to debate
I know you
that
don't.
with you.
But what am I then? Well, I'm looking around in the world, and I'm taking all this information in, not just by consciously thinking and perceiving, but also through action, through being conditioned. And this is the thing, this conditioning that is on the macro scale very obvious, that we are conditioned by our environments. We become our environments in a sense, and we take everything that has happened to us and unify it into what we are. And I think this is the what this quote is that I just read is talking about. The many become one and are increased by one. And so even if I don't understand the true intricacies of his system, which really are quite intricate, I can see there's I don't know, I really believe there's a level that, that speaks to me, and it's precisely this.
That's very interesting, but I am now strapped with the intuition, having never read this, that there is a high level of mind dependency in this philosophy. And not just in the sense that he thinks a lot of the world is mind dependent. I think that, that's kind of page one for at least us. But that the way that he is describing the fundamental nature of reality is as mind dependent. That there is a mental component fundamentally in the world.
Yes, for him, all his processes have, this is actually the name he uses. He says every process has, or actual occasion, I should say, the more basic ones, they have a physical pole and a mental pole. And so in that sense, he really is a monist in terms of...
Dual aspect monist, yeah.
Yeah, dual aspect monist. In that he brings the material and the mind. He doesn't really... I mean, they have different functions. This is for sure, but there is something that they both belong to. And
I mean, I think that I definitely have an affinity towards this kind of dual aspect theory of mind, where mind is kind of a component of, or, and then we can go back a little bit, jumping back in history a bit to another very early process metaphysician, what I see in Schopenhauer, who thinks that everything is this subjective experience of will, which also manifests itself materially as matter. So then there's kind of both the subjective dimension and the objective dimension of the same thing, which is kind of the process of willing, right? And I don't know, I'm intrigued that this mental stuff, this mental component, whatever you want to call it. So Bergson will call it something closer to, he used the word élan vital, which is like kind of like the vital force. There's kind of this mental pull.
That's the one that I'm very much...
you don't like that one?
I don't like that one.
I like that one. I like that better, I think, I think it's basically the same as mental pull, but it does seem to have a little bit more fundamental a place than matter for him, which is... I
mean, again, I don't read Bergson as much as you do, so it's the same problem, but I always, when I hear that verse... That term élan vital, I get this, the magic juice of life.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry. Continue.
No, but it's the same thing. And I think the closest we get to a naturalist in that kind of volitional idea of being, because I think this élan vital is very similar to that Schopenhauerian will, right? Very, very similar. But Nietzsche also has this very strong-going materialism, and yet has to make place for the will, and ends up with a process metaphysics. And I think it's interesting, maybe you can't have process metaphysics without reifying the mental as something ontologically fundamental. Does that? I think that this is just popped into my head, but I can't, there's not that many examples to work with when we're doing process metaphysics, but...
True. Well, at least it would be very difficult not to. I mean, there definitely is... I think when you look at the history of process philosophy, there's definitely a tendency to prefer the mind, if you will.
Absolutely.
You can,
but
Hegel
I don't
is
know.
Also very much.
Yeah, for sure. Well,
Bergson.
Marx is allegedly a process philosopher, and Marx is a famous materialist.
But he's very much not a process
metaphysician,
because
not
he's
at all.
very much not a metaphysician.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But now in that sense, in the more broader sense of process philosophy, there's probably a few more people that we could include, like Marx, that do see the development in the world, but who just do not want to.
I think that. So, I'm talking now right out of my ass because I don't know that much about Marx, but I'm pretty sure that he is talking relatively metaphysically insofar as he's describing. So his big beef with Hegel is Hegel thinks that the movement of history is the movement of the idea, and he says wrong, it's matter. Already this is a metaphysical treatise, right? That's a metaphysical claim, that matter is the driver of history, and that matter is then the driver of change, which is what he wants to say. So that's actually might be our only example, or at least the only one that I can think of. Because I guess there is something in Nietzsche, but Nietzsche's so fucking enigmatic that you can't pin him down on these dichotomies, these kind of like, these schools. You can't get him in there.
I don't know. I just always, like, I also don't know shit about Karl Marx.
but
I always had him in my mind as, you know, the guy who, you know, called the advent of the end of metaphysics in modern philosophy. You know, he's like the first guy's like, fuck metaphysics, man. It's bullshit. We need to speak about the world, about matter, about things.
Yeah.
You know?
But maybe that's a metaphysical tendency. I mean,
Yeah,
because
no,
you
but
definitely
I see what you
already
mean,
have that
that
in. Marx can't be the first, because you have Hegel, not Hegel, but Hume telling us to throw everything to the flames that doesn't talk about cold hard facts.
Yeah, fair.
But yes, okay. I think that
Maybe we should just not talk about Marx.
maybe we should not talk about
if
shit we
neither
don't
of
know
us
about.
know.
But that doesn't. I don't know. It feels wrong as a philosopher. I have this urge talk about shit I don't know.
Yeah, I see.
So maybe it's more us. Maybe that's why we end up with these guys who are really into change, really into temporality, and really into the mind as something metaphysical. Maybe that's our kind
preference?
of pre-philosophical intuitions, or more philosophical drives.
Well, it's definitely a philosophical drive. I'm not sure if it's a pre-philosophical drive.
Yeah,
for me.
I was
'Cause
correcting myself on that.
If
Yeah.
I think about my pre-philosophical times, and even my early philosophical times, you know, I started being, when I was, I think, how old was I? 13, 14, when I got my first philosophy book.
Oh yeah.
And I read about Descartes' cogito ergo sum. I was sold, man. and then I spent a long time being a solipsist.
Oh shit.
And then my first favorite Greek philosopher was Parmenides.
Oh
So I
my
can't
God.
really say that
okay.
that the process is really.
Yeah.
It was a process for me to become a process philosopher.
That's lovely. That's very nice. Yeah. Well, I think this kind of brings me to another interesting point, which is a little bit outside of the discussion of process philosophy and more into metaphilosophy in general.
Yeah.
I was thinking the other day about how much of philosophy is driven by specific desires. And this is something which Nietzsche talks about a little bit, but he does it a little bit differently. He thinks that philosophies emerge out of psychological conditions, and he goes about diagnosing the history of philosophy with various mental illnesses, which is hilarious. But I do think, I think that's a bit extreme, but I think that there is something to be said for this idea that when we do philosophy, we approach it with some thing that we want to get out of it, some conclusion that we kind of want. And in analytic philosophy, I think people are a little bit more open about what they want, because they'll say it. They'll be like, what we want to be able to say is X, right?
Yeah.
That's a phrase that I've read a lot of times in analytic philosophy.
Yeah.
Continental philosophers also want something. They want to, well, I don't know. I can't speak about all continental philosophy. It already is problematic. But, do you see what I mean? That there's kind of this I have a desired conclusion before I begin the inquiry.
Well, I think, I think you're definitely right. But also,
isn't that rather damning?
Well, yes, but also, what else?
Yeah.
Like, and this is the thing.
Well, the Buddhists would say you turn that shit off. Turn off your fucking desires.
Yeah, but it's not even about desires. I think it's about some presupposition.
Mm-hmm.
And I really, it's a very, very complex problem, presuppositions in philosophy, I think.
Which luckily Hegel solved for us.
Yes, thank God. Hegel's work is done here. Damn. Okay. No, but it is that thing that Hegel also saw, that, it's very problematic to start with some type of assumption about the way the world works. But I think it's admirable that Hegel tries so hard to go hypercritical after Kant, and not only really really be critical about your presuppositions, but I really doubt whether it's ultimately possible. I mean, he says that he's done it. I'm not really convinced, but also
I don't think so either. Yeah.
but and this is the thing that ultimately philosophy is, it's a human enterprise. It's something that humans do. And what are humans? They're empirical, accidental fucking animals that walk around this earth and do shit.
Yeah.
And so you cannot how much you want it, and we'll get back to desire, if you even if you want to be presuppositionless and you want to take the absolute zero standpoint, you can't, and you're actually denying a lot. And so I think that I don't know. It's very difficult.
Well, presuppositionlessness,
like what to do with it, because on the other hand, I'm also like, yeah, sure. If you do start, you do need to be critical of yourself, of where you start. You need to at least be aware of the kind of presuppositions that you take, even if you know that you cannot get rid of all of them. At least try to be aware. It's like, yeah, I do assume that the world is in this way, and I'm gonna say, the argument by Shirley. And this is in analytic philosophy, there's this guy that got highly criticized by some other guy. I'm not gonna look it up. Two philosophers in discussion, and one of them had this argument that went like, well, surely da 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 da. And the other guy was like, well, if you start your sentence with surely, you're really not doing philosophy, man.
Yeah.
And in one sense, I completely agree. Like,
and in the other sense, you have to disagree.
But in the other sense, you need to take something.
Yeah.
And maybe that is very basic, and maybe some people can get away with it, like Hegel, or like what's his face? Arabic philosopher.
There's a Mullah Sadra?
Maybe was it Mullah Sadra?
I can just keep dropping names. I don't know.
But Dawi is gonna hate me for this, that I forgot. Well, anyway, there's this one Arabic philosopher, and he starts one of his works with, surely there is existence. Obviously there is being, this kind of,
that seems like as basically presuppositionless as you can get.
Like I said, like even
also Hegel's starting point.
But and maybe they can get away with it. I'm not sure. I think it's very difficult to think about this, whether this works or not. If it actually makes sense to make such a start. But at least I don't think that you can ever get away with having to say at one point in your philosophy, well, surely this is right. I mean, come on, guys.
Yeah.
I've given all my arguments for everything, but at least grant me this. and in the end, I really don't expect that philosophy is the kind of enterprise that is ever going to be finished.
No.
Truly. So in that sense, I don't think we really need to worry about getting rid of the
human element.
Yeah. And rather, if we can incorporate our own standpoint, but be mindful of that, say like, well, I am this human in this time, in this context, and to me, this is how the world makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, that's just not even for other people. If I can do that for myself, I'd be very fucking happy.
Yeah. Well, I guess philosophy won't have an end, but maybe this podcast has reached its end.
I think so too, man.
It was a damn good time. I enjoyed
a good
myself.
Talk. Yeah.
We finished our La Choufs.
Yeah.
La Chouf.
Well, thank you, Kian.
Thank you, Sven, for having me. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, and thank you all for listening to this episode. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Hope you guys enjoyed it. We will be back next month. Who knows who's going to be the host? Maybe it's going to be me again. It's going to be the Sven Show. I don't know. Maybe it's going to be someone else. The thing is, this podcast is made by members of the Symposion Study Association. And for those of you that do study philosophy here in Leiden, we are more than willing to hear your suggestions for topics, for talks. You can also offer, if you want to be talking on this podcast, you're more than welcome to send us a message, and we can see if we can facilitate some more interesting conversations. Thank you very much. And that's
Thank
it.
you, guys.